Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here with some absolutely wild stories from the depths of Reddit that'll either help you drift off or keep you wide awake wondering how people can actually behave like this. Whether you're winding down after a long day, dealing with insomnia, or just need some background noise, you're in the right place. I've got a collection of stories tonight that range from family drama to workplace chaos to relationships gone completely sideways. So grab your favorite snack, get comfortable, and let's dive into some tales. Our first story comes from someone who thought his gym membership was just about fitness. Boy, was he wrong. I'm 23 years old, and I've been going to the same gym for about 2 years now. It's one of those 24-hour fitness places where you can swipe in anytime, and I usually go pretty late, around 10 or 11 at night when it's mostly empty. I work a late shift at a restaurant, so the late night hours work perfectly for my schedule. Plus, I prefer working out when there aren't many people around. I can use whatever equipment I want without waiting, and there's less pressure to perform or look like I know what I'm doing. About 6 months ago, I started noticing this guy named Derek, who also worked out late at night. He looked to be in his mid-30s, pretty fit, and seemed like he took his training seriously. We'd nod at each other, maybe spot each other on bench press occasionally, just the normal gym acquaintance stuff. Derek seemed like a decent guy, always polite, never hogged equipment, and minded his own business for the most part. After a few months of seeing each other regularly, Derek started making conversation. He'd ask about my workout routine, what supplements I used, whether I was training for anything specific, typical gym talk. I appreciated having someone to discuss fitness with, since most of my friends aren't really into working out. Eventually, we exchanged numbers so we could coordinate our schedules and work out together sometimes. Having a gym buddy made the late night sessions more enjoyable, and Derek was actually pretty knowledgeable about fitness and proper form. About 3 months ago, Derek started asking me questions that seemed a bit odd. He wanted to know where I lived, specifically which apartment complex and which floor. He asked what kind of car I drove, what the license plate was, whether I had roommates. I figured he was just making conversation, or maybe looking for a new place to live himself, so I answered honestly, without thinking much of it. Looking back, I should have recognized these as red flags, but hindsight is always 20/20. Then Derek started showing up at places I frequented. I'd be grabbing coffee at my usual spot on my day off, and Derek would walk in 5 minutes later, acting surprised to see me. Or I'd be at the grocery store near my apartment at 9 in the morning on a Saturday, and there he'd be in the same aisle, commenting on what a coincidence it was. At first, I thought it really was just coincidence. We lived in the same general area, shopped at the same stores, so running into each other seemed plausible enough. But the encounters became more frequent and more specific. Derek would show up at restaurants I'd mentioned wanting to try, coffee shops I'd said I liked, even at the park where I'd told him I sometimes went running. The coincidences were piling up in ways that started to feel less random and more intentional. Derek would mention things about my schedule that I didn't remember telling him. He'd know when I had days off work or when I'd changed my workout routine. He'd reference conversations I'd had with other people at the gym, even when he hadn't been anywhere nearby when those conversations happened. I started to feel uncomfortable but didn't want to seem paranoid or unfriendly. Maybe Derek was just really social and happened to frequent the same places I did. Maybe I'd told him more about my schedule than I remembered. I tried to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation for all these coincidences. The situation got really weird when I came home from work one night, around 2 in the morning. My apartment is on the 2nd floor of a 3-story building, and as I was walking up the exterior stairs, I noticed someone sitting in a car across the street with the engine off. The interior light was on, and I could clearly see it was Derek, just sitting there staring at my building. He had a notebook in his lap and appeared to be writing something. I stood at my door for a minute, trying to decide what to do. Derek must have seen me because he immediately closed the notebook, started his car, and drove away quickly without looking in my direction. My heart was pounding, There was absolutely no legitimate reason for Derek to be parked outside my apartment at 2 in the morning. I convinced myself that maybe he'd been waiting for someone else in the building, or maybe he'd just pulled over to make a phone call or check directions. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day at the gym, Derek acted completely normal, like nothing had happened. He asked how my workout was going, spotted me on a few sets, talked about his plans for the weekend. I didn't bring up seeing him outside my apartment because I wasn't sure how to approach it without sounding accusatory. Maybe there really was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was being paranoid and jumping to conclusions. But then I found the notebook. I was using one of the treadmills near the locker room, cooling down after my workout, when I noticed a small black notebook on the floor near Derek's usual locker. I picked it up, planning to put it on the lost and found shelf at the front desk, but it fell open to a page that had my name written at the top in capital letters. What I saw made my blood run cold and my stomach drop. Derek had been keeping detailed logs of my activities, my movements, basically my entire life. There were pages and pages of notes about my schedule, the routes I took to and from the gym, descriptions of my car, including the license plate number, even sketches of my apartment building with my specific window marked with an X and an arrow. He documented what I wore on different days, who I talked to at the gym, what times I usually arrived and left, even what I typically bought at the grocery store. The notebook included personal information about me that I'd never shared with him directly. My workplace address was written down with notes about what time I usually arrived and left. My full legal name was there, which I'd never told him. Even the names of some family members were listed, information he must have found by stalking my social media profiles. There were notes about my habits and preferences, things I'd mentioned casually in conversation, but he'd recorded in disturbing detail. He'd written down that I preferred protein shakes after workouts, that I usually ordered a large coffee with almond milk, that I drove a blue Honda Civic, that I lived alone. Some of the entries were dated going back 4 months, which meant Derek had been systematically documenting my life for a significant portion of our friendship. There were notes like, arrives gym 10:15 p.m. and leaves around midnight and parks in same spot near entrance. He'd tracked patterns in my behavior with the kind of detail that suggested careful, ongoing surveillance. I immediately took the notebook to gym management and explained what I'd found. The staff were horrified when they flipped through the pages and saw the extent of Derek's documentation. They immediately revoked his membership and banned him from the premises. They also helped me file a police report, providing security footage that showed Derek following me to my car on multiple occasions, filming me on his phone without my knowledge, and even going through my gym bag once when I'd left it near the bench while using the bathroom. The police took the situation very seriously once they saw the notebook and the security footage. The detective I spoke with said this kind of obsessive behavior often escalates from surveillance to more direct confrontation or violence. She said I'd done exactly the right thing by reporting it immediately, rather than confronting Derek directly, which could have triggered a dangerous response. They issued Derek a restraining order and opened an investigation into whether he'd committed any crimes beyond stalking. Derek tried to contact me multiple times after being banned from the gym. He sent text messages through the number we'd exchanged, claiming I'd completely misunderstood his intentions and that he was just trying to be a good friend. He said the notebook was just his way of trying to remember details about people he cared about so he could be more thoughtful and attentive. He insisted that I was overreacting to normal friendly behavior and that if I'd just give him a chance to explain, I'd understand that everything was innocent. But there was nothing innocent or normal about the level of surveillance Derek had been conducting. The police investigation revealed that he'd been doing extensive internet searches about me, trying to find additional personal information beyond what I'd shared. He'd even contacted my employer, pretending to be an old friend from college trying to get in touch, hoping they'd give him more details about my schedule or personal life. I ended up switching gyms entirely, even though I'd been a member at that location for 2 years and had built a comfortable routine there. I couldn't risk running into Derek or having him know where I worked out. I also installed security cameras at my apartment entrance and in the hallway, and I changed my daily routines to be less predictable. I vary my workout times, take different routes home, park in different spots. The whole experience made me much more cautious about who I share personal information with, even in seemingly casual conversations. Derek was eventually charged with stalking and harassment. During the court proceedings, it came out that I wasn't his first victim. He had a documented history of becoming obsessed with people he met at gyms, gradually escalating his surveillance until someone reported him or got a restraining order. Then he'd just move on to a new gym in a different part of town and start the pattern over again with a new target. The prosecutor said Derek had done this at least 4 times over the past 6 years, always with young men in their 20s who worked out late at night when the gym was mostly empty. The scariest part was realizing how long the stalking had been going on without me noticing or taking it seriously. Derek had spent months documenting my life, following me around, learning my patterns and habits, and I'd been completely oblivious until I found that notebook. Looking back, there were probably dozens of warning signs I missed or explained away. The frequent coincidental encounters, the oddly specific knowledge about my schedule, the personal questions that went beyond normal gym friendship conversation. I'm grateful that I found the evidence before Derek's behavior escalated further. The detective told me that stalkers like him often become more aggressive when they feel their target is pulling away or when they're not getting the response they want from their surveillance. Who knows what might have happened if I'd confronted him directly, or if he'd decided to move from passive observation to more active engagement. The whole experience taught me that trusting your instincts is important. I'd felt uncomfortable with Derek's behavior for weeks before finding the notebook, but I'd talked myself out of those feelings because I didn't want to seem paranoid or accusatory. Now I know that when something feels off, it probably is, and it's better to be cautious than to ignore warning signs in the name of being polite. That's the end of that story. The fact that he was keeping a detailed surveillance notebook like some kind of amateur detective is genuinely terrifying. When someone documents your license plate number, your window location, and your daily routines, that's way beyond trying to be friendly. Some people really can't tell the difference between making a friend and stalking a target. This guy had literally turned friendship into a surveillance operation. Speaking of people who can't respect boundaries, this next story involves a family member who thought sentimental value meant they could just help themselves to whatever they wanted. I'm 31 years old and recently inherited my grandfather's vintage car collection when he passed away last year. My grandfather had been collecting classic cars since the 1960s, and he had some really valuable pieces. We're talking original muscle cars, perfectly restored classics, vehicles with documented racing history, the kind of automobiles that appreciate in value every year and make collectors drool when they see them at car shows. My grandfather specifically left the collection to me in his will because we'd bonded over cars throughout my childhood. He'd taught me how to work on engines, change oil, replace spark plugs, all the basics of automotive maintenance. He'd take me to car shows every summer, and we'd spend hours talking about different makes and models, the history of American manufacturing, the golden age of muscle cars. He'd always said I was the only one in the family who truly appreciated automotive history the way he did, who understood that these weren't just cars, but pieces of American culture and engineering excellence. The collection was worth roughly $200,000, according to the most recent appraisal, and my grandfather had made his wishes very clear about who should inherit it. The will was specific and detailed, leaving no room for interpretation. Everything was supposed to go to me, along with his tools, his garage, and all the documentation he'd collected about each vehicle's provenance and restoration history. My uncle Frank had always been jealous of my relationship with my grandfather. Frank was my grandfather's oldest son, and he felt entitled to the car collection simply by virtue of being the firstborn child. He'd never shown much interest in the cars when my grandfather was alive, never helped with maintenance or restoration projects, never attended car shows or expressed genuine enthusiasm for the collection. But once my grandfather died and the will was read, suddenly Frank was furious that the cars were going to me instead of him. Frank contested the will initially, claiming my grandfather wasn't in his right mind when he'd made those decisions. He hired a lawyer and tried to argue that my grandfather had been experiencing cognitive decline and had been unduly influenced by me to change his will in my favor. But the will had been written 7 years before my grandfather's death, when he was in perfect health and completely mentally sharp. There were multiple witnesses, medical documentation proving his competency, and no evidence of any cognitive impairment. The cars legally belonged to me, and there was nothing Frank could do about it through legal channels. After the will contest failed, Frank seemed to accept the situation. He stopped arguing about the inheritance, and even apologized for challenging my grandfather's wishes. I thought maybe he'd finally made peace with the decision, and we could move forward as family. I was wrong about that. I decided to keep the cars in my grandfather's old garage, while I figured out what to do with the collection long term. Some pieces I wanted to keep for sentimental reasons, particularly the 1967 Mustang that my grandfather had owned since it was new. Others I was considering selling to help with a down payment on a house and to fund my own automotive projects. The garage was secure and climate controlled, perfect for preserving the vehicles, and I had insurance coverage for the full appraised value. Last month, I stopped by the garage to check on the cars and do some routine maintenance. I try to visit at least once a week to make sure everything's in good condition, start the engines, check fluid levels, that sort of thing. But when I arrived and unlocked the door, I noticed immediately that one car was missing. The 1969 Dodge Charger, one of the most valuable pieces in the collection, was just gone. The space where it usually sat was completely empty. My first thought was that the garage had been broken into and the car stolen. I checked the doors and windows for signs of forced entry, but everything looked normal. The locks were intact, there was no broken glass, no damage to the door frames. Whoever had taken the car had used a key to enter, not broken in. I called the police immediately to report the theft, but when the officers started investigating and reviewing security footage from neighbouring businesses, they found something interesting that changed the nature of the case entirely. The security camera from a business across the street had captured footage of someone using a key to enter the garage 2 days earlier, and that someone was my Uncle Frank. The footage showed Frank calmly walking up to the garage, unlocking the door like he owned the place, and then driving the Charger out onto the street. He didn't break anything or act suspicious. He just took the car like it belonged to him, like he had every right to drive away with a $45,000 vehicle that legally wasn't his property. When the police contacted Frank about the stolen vehicle, he didn't even try to deny taking it. He claimed he had every right to take the car because his father would have wanted him to have at least one vehicle from the collection. He said I was being greedy by keeping everything for myself when he was the biological son and should have priority in the inheritance. Frank genuinely seemed to believe that his emotional connection to his deceased father gave him legal ownership of property that had been explicitly left to someone else in a valid will. Frank's logic was that family heirlooms should stay within the direct bloodline, and since he was my grandfather's son and I was only a grandson, he had superior claim to the collection. He thought the will was just a suggestion or a guideline, not a legally binding document that actually determined ownership. The level of entitlement required to reach this conclusion was staggering. The Charger was recovered from Frank's personal garage, where he'd been proudly showing it off to friends and neighbours like it was his own recent acquisition. He'd even had professional photos taken with the car, posting them on social media with captions about inheriting his father's legacy and continuing the family tradition of collecting classic automobiles. The audacity of stealing a $45,000 vehicle and then publicly bragging about it on Facebook was almost impressive in its complete stupidity. Frank had told everyone that his father had left him the car, that it was his inheritance, that he was honoured to carry on his father's passion for automotive history. He'd given interviews to local car enthusiast groups about his plans for the vehicle, talking about restoration projects and car show appearances. He'd completely constructed this fantasy, where he was the rightful owner, despite having literally stolen the car from a locked garage. Frank was arrested and charged with grand theft auto. The value of the charger, approximately $45,000 based on recent appraisals, meant he was facing serious felony charges with potential prison time. Our family was torn apart by the whole situation. Some relatives thought I should drop the charges because Frank was family and didn't deserve to go to prison. They argued that I had plenty of other cars and that losing one wouldn't really hurt me financially. They said family should forgive family and that pressing charges was vindictive and cruel. Other family members supported my decision to hold Frank accountable, pointing out that theft is theft regardless of the family relationship. They noted that Frank had shown no remorse, had lied to people about how he acquired the car, and had only been caught because of security camera footage. If he'd gotten away with stealing the charger, what would have stopped him from coming back for the other vehicles? I refused to drop the charges despite family pressure. Frank had violated my property rights, stolen a valuable vehicle, and then lied about it to everyone. His actions weren't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated decision to take something that didn't belong to him. He'd obtained a copy of the garage key somehow, probably when he'd helped clean out my grandfather's house after the funeral, and had been planning this theft for months while pretending to accept the will's provisions. The legal process was lengthy and stressful. Frank initially pleaded not guilty, claiming he'd had permission to borrow the car, but there was no evidence supporting this claim. Eventually, faced with the security footage and my testimony, he changed his plea to guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Frank received probation, community service, and was ordered to pay restitution for legal fees and the cost of recovering the vehicle. He's also permanently banned from my grandfather's garage and from having any contact with me. Our relationship is permanently destroyed, and several other family relationships have been damaged by the conflict. The saddest part is that my grandfather would have been heartbroken to see his son behave this way. He'd left the collection to me specifically because he wanted someone who would appreciate and care for the cars, not someone who saw them as financial assets or status symbols. Frank's theft proved exactly why my grandfather had made the decision he did about the inheritance. That's the end of that story. Stealing a $45,000 classic car and then posting about it on social media like you inherited it legally takes a special kind of entitled thinking. The fact that he couldn't comprehend why taking someone else's property was wrong shows how deep that sense of entitlement ran. Some people really think family relationships give them rights to other people's legally owned property. Now let's shift to a relationship story that shows how some people handle rejection by turning into complete nightmares. I'm 28 years old, and I recently went through a breakup with my girlfriend of 4 years, Michelle. The relationship had run its course naturally over time. We'd grown apart, developed different interests and goals, stopped communicating effectively. The split was mutual and relatively amicable when it happened. We agreed to remain friends and go our separate ways without drama or resentment. We'd had good years together, but sometimes relationships just reach their natural endpoint. Michelle moved out of our shared apartment about 3 months ago. We divided our belongings fairly, split the furniture we'd bought together, closed joint bank accounts, all the practical stuff that comes with ending a long-term relationship. I thought that would be the end of our romantic involvement. We'd occasionally text about logistics, like when she needed to pick up mail that had been forwarded to the old address, or when I found something of hers that had been left behind. Everything seemed fine and mature. Then, about 6 weeks ago, Michelle started dating someone new. Her new boyfriend posted a photo of them together on social media, some candid shot from a coffee shop or restaurant. They looked happy together, smiling at the camera, clearly in that early relationship glow. I'll admit it stung a bit, seeing her move on so quickly, but I genuinely wanted her to be happy. I'd accepted that our relationship was over, and if she'd found someone new who made her happy, that was good for her. I even left a supportive comment on the post, something generic about wishing them well and hoping they'd be happy together. That's when things got weird. Almost immediately after I left that comment, Michelle started texting me constantly. She'd send messages at odd hours asking how I was doing, whether I was okay with her new relationship, if I was upset about seeing her with someone else. She'd ask detailed questions about my emotional state, wanting to know if I was sad, if I missed her, if I regretted our breakup. The frequency and intensity of her messages seemed really odd given that she was supposedly happy with someone new. Michelle started analyzing our past relationship through text, sending long messages about what went wrong and whether we'd made a mistake breaking up. She'd bring up memories from our time together, ask if I remembered specific moments, want to discuss what those memories meant to both of us. It felt like she was trying to keep our relationship alive emotionally, even though she was supposedly moving forward with someone new. Then Michelle started showing up at places she knew I'd be. My favorite coffee shop, where I'd go weekend mornings. The gym I'd started attending after the breakup. Even the grocery store I shopped at near my apartment. She'd always act surprised to see me, like these encounters were pure coincidence, but they happened too frequently to be accidental. She clearly knew my schedule and was deliberately positioning herself to run into me. Her new boyfriend was never with her during these encounters, which I thought was strange. If Michelle was happy in her new relationship, why was she spending so much time and energy tracking me down for conversations? She'd want to have long talks about how we were both doing, ask detailed questions about my life, my work, whether I was dating anyone. The conversations felt like she was testing the waters, trying to gauge whether I still had feelings for her or might be interested in rekindling something. One night, around 11:30, there was a knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late enough that a random visitor seemed unusual. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Michelle standing in the hallway. She was crying, her makeup running down her face, clearly upset about something. Against my better judgment, I let her in. She seemed genuinely distressed, and despite our breakup, I still cared about her well-being. I made her some tea and sat with her on the couch while she vented about having a fight with her new boyfriend. She talked for almost 2 hours about how he didn't understand her, how their communication wasn't as good as ours had been, how she was starting to question whether leaving our relationship had been the right decision. Michelle kept comparing her new boyfriend to me, always in ways that painted me as the better partner. She'd say things like, "He doesn't listen the way you did," or "He doesn't remember little details about me like you always did," or "We don't have the same connection that you and I had." The whole conversation felt manipulative, designed to make me feel like I should want her back, like I should be fighting for our relationship instead of accepting that it was over. When I gently suggested that maybe she should work on her current relationship or talk to a therapist instead of her ex-boyfriend, Michelle got upset. She accused me of not caring about her anymore, said she thought we could at least still be friends who supported each other through difficult times. She made it sound like I was being cold and unsupportive by suggesting she talk to someone other than me about her relationship problems. The late-night visits became a pattern over the next few weeks. Michelle would find reasons to come over, always when her boyfriend was supposedly busy or they'd had some disagreement. She'd wear outfits I used to compliment her on, bring up inside jokes from our relationship, reference memories and experiences we'd shared. It was clear she was trying to rekindle something romantic, trying to remind me of what we'd had together, even while she was actively dating someone else. Things came to a head when Michelle's boyfriend contacted me directly. He'd found our extensive text conversations on her phone and wanted to know what was going on between us. I felt terrible having to explain that Michelle had been pursuing me behind his back, and that I'd been trying to maintain appropriate boundaries with an ex while she kept pushing for more. The boyfriend was understandably upset, but he was angry at Michelle, not me. He said she'd been lying to him about where she was going and who she was spending time with. The late-night visits to my apartment had been explained to him as girls' nights with friends or work obligations, never as visits to her ex-boyfriend's place. She'd been conducting essentially an emotional affair, if not worse, while supposedly committed to a new relationship. Michelle called me furious after her boyfriend confronted her with the evidence. She blamed me for ruining her new relationship, accused me of being jealous that she'd moved on and intentionally sabotaging her happiness. She claimed I'd betrayed her trust by telling her boyfriend about our conversations and visits, even though he'd found the evidence himself and approached me for clarification. The mental gymnastics required to reach that conclusion were impressive. I told Michelle that I needed her to stop contacting me, and that our friendship clearly wasn't healthy for either of us. She needed to focus on her own relationships and life, without using me as an emotional backup plan whenever things got difficult with someone else. I explained that what she'd been doing wasn't fair to me, to her boyfriend, or to herself. Michelle didn't take the boundary well. She started leaving me voicemails late at night, sometimes drunk, and rambling about our past relationship and how good we'd been together. She'd drive by my apartment and text me that she was nearby if I wanted to talk, if I wanted to reconsider our friendship, if I wanted to give us another chance. The behavior was moving from inappropriate to genuinely concerning. She sent long emails analyzing what had gone wrong with our relationship and proposing ways we could fix things if we got back together. She'd outlined specific changes she'd make, behaviors she'd modify, compromises she'd be willing to accept. It was clear she'd been thinking about reconciliation extensively, building entire scenarios in her head about how we could restart our relationship. I finally had to block Michelle's number and all her social media accounts. I also informed my building's security about the situation and asked them not to let her into the building without my explicit permission. It felt extreme taking these steps against someone I'd once loved and lived with, but Michelle's inability to respect boundaries had left me no choice. Her behavior had escalated from uncomfortable to potentially stalkerish. The last I heard through mutual friends, Michelle and her boyfriend had broken up shortly after their confrontation. She'd apparently moved to a different city for a job opportunity, which I was relieved to hear. The physical distance meant I didn't have to worry about random encounters or surprise visits anymore. I hope Michelle is getting help working through whatever was driving her behavior. Her inability to let go of our relationship while simultaneously pursuing someone new suggested some deeper issues around attachment and validation that professional therapy could address. I genuinely want her to be happy and healthy, but I couldn't be the person who helped her get there. Looking back, I realize I should have been firmer about boundaries much earlier in this situation. Letting Michelle come over for that first late-night conversation opened a door I should have kept firmly closed. Sometimes, being kind to an ex means being very clear about what kind of relationship you can realistically maintain after a romantic relationship ends. Blurred boundaries help no one and often make moving on harder for everyone involved. That's the end of that story. Using your new relationship to make your ex jealous and then showing up at their apartment crying about your new boyfriend is textbook manipulation. The fact that she blamed him for ruining her relationship when she was the one lying and essentially cheating shows exactly zero accountability. Some people really can't handle not being someone's priority anymore, even when they're the ones who agreed to end the relationship. Our next tale involves a neighbour whose idea of being helpful crossed about 17 different legal and ethical lines. I'm 35 years old, and I live in a quiet suburban neighbourhood. It's one of those places where people know their neighbours, where kids play in the streets on summer evenings, where everyone waves when they drive by. Most of my neighbours are friendly and respectful of boundaries, which made what happened with Patricia even more shocking. About a year ago, a new family moved in next door. The wife, Patricia, seemed friendly enough when we first met over the fence, separating our properties. She introduced herself enthusiastically, mentioned that she was a stay-at-home mom with 3 young kids, and said she loved gardening and keeping busy around the house. She seemed like she'd be a good neighbour, someone who'd be pleasant but not intrusive. Patricia started making comments about my property pretty early on. She'd mentioned that my lawn looked like it needed mowing, or that my hedges were getting a bit overgrown, or that I had some weeds in my flower beds. At first, I took these as friendly observations, maybe her way of making conversation. I'd thank her for pointing things out, and handle the tasks on my own schedule. But Patricia's comments became more frequent and more insistent. She'd bring up the same issues multiple times, act concerned that I wasn't addressing them quickly enough, suggest that property maintenance was important for neighborhood appearance and home values. It started to feel less like friendly conversation and more like criticism of my choices about my own property. Then Patricia started offering to help with tasks around my yard. She'd volunteer to mow my lawn if I was too busy, suggest she could trim my hedges since she'd be doing hers anyway, offer to plant flowers in my empty flower beds. I politely declined these offers, explaining that I preferred to handle my own property maintenance on my own schedule. I appreciated her willingness to help, but didn't need assistance with basic yard work. One Saturday morning, I woke up around 8:30 to the sound of a lawnmower. I looked outside to see Patricia mowing my entire front yard without permission. She was about halfway through, pushing my own lawnmower that she'd apparently taken from my garage. When I went outside to ask what she was doing, she smiled brightly and said she'd noticed I'd been too busy to keep up with yard work and wanted to help out as a good neighbor. I politely but firmly thanked her and explained that I preferred to handle my own property maintenance. Patricia seemed genuinely offended by my reaction. She said that neighbors should help each other and that she was just being friendly and community-minded. She finished mowing the lawn before I could stop her, then refused to accept any payment for her unsolicited work, claiming that good neighbors don't charge each other for favors. The uninvited help continued despite my clear statements that I didn't want or need her assistance. Patricia would trim my bushes when she thought they looked unruly, pull weeds from my flower beds, even wash my car in my driveway while I was at work. Every time I'd ask her to stop, she'd act hurt and say she was just trying to be a good neighbor. She seemed unable to understand that her help was unwanted, that I had the right to maintain my own property according to my own standards and timeline. Things escalated significantly when I came home from a week-long business trip. I'd been traveling for work, and my property had been unattended for 7 days. When I pulled into my driveway, I immediately noticed that something was different about my backyard. I could see from the driveway that my patio furniture had been rearranged completely. I went to investigate and discovered that Patricia had somehow entered my fenced backyard, despite the locked gate, and had completely reorganized my outdoor space. She'd moved my patio furniture into different configurations, rearranged my potted plants, and even planted new flowers in my garden beds. She'd removed plants I'd specifically chosen and replaced them with varieties she apparently preferred. The new flowers were nice enough, but they weren't what I wanted in my garden. I'd carefully selected native plants that required minimal water and maintenance, and Patricia had replaced some of them with high-maintenance ornamentals that needed regular care. She'd completely disregarded my landscaping choices and imposed her own aesthetic preferences on my property. When I confronted Patricia about entering my property without permission, she didn't seem to understand why I was upset. She said she'd noticed the backyard looking neglected while I was away, and knew I'd be grateful when I saw the improvements she'd made. When I asked how she'd gotten into my fenced yard with a locked gate, she cheerfully admitted she'd climbed over the fence because she wanted to surprise me with the improvements. Patricia explained that she'd spent 3 full days working on my backyard while I was gone. She'd devoted hours to planning the layout, purchasing new plants, and implementing her vision for my outdoor space. She expected me to be thrilled with the results, and couldn't understand why I was angry instead of grateful. I was furious, but tried to remain calm and clear. I explained that entering someone's property without permission, even with good intentions, was trespassing. I told her that climbing over my fence and working on my property for 3 days without asking was absolutely not acceptable behavior. Patricia got defensive and said I was being ungrateful for all her hard work. She couldn't seem to grasp the fundamental concept that my property was mine to manage, not hers to improve without consent. The situation reached an absolute breaking point when Patricia let herself into my house. I'd forgotten to lock my back door one morning when I left for work in a rush. I'd had an early meeting and wasn't thinking clearly during my morning routine. Patricia apparently saw this as an invitation, or at minimum, as an opportunity she couldn't pass up. I came home that evening, around 6:30, to find Patricia inside my kitchen. She was reorganizing my cabinets and pantry, humming to herself while she worked. My kitchen counters were covered with all the contents of my cabinets, sorted into piles she'd deemed necessary to keep versus items she'd decided I should throw away. Patricia had completely rearranged everything in my kitchen according to her own organizational system. She'd thrown out food items she deemed unhealthy or expired, and had actually purchased replacement groceries with her own money to restock my pantry with items she thought were better choices. She'd cleaned my entire kitchen, moving appliances, reorganizing drawers, even rearranging my refrigerator contents according to some system that made sense to her but was completely foreign to me. When I found her inside my home, standing in my kitchen like she owned the place, I immediately called the police. Patricia was absolutely shocked that I'd involved law enforcement. She kept insisting that she was just being helpful, that she'd seen the unlocked door and thought I'd appreciate coming home to an organized kitchen. She genuinely couldn't comprehend that entering someone's home without permission was a crime, regardless of her intentions or how helpful she thought she was being. The police arrived within 10 minutes. They explained to Patricia, very clearly and with no room for misinterpretation, that her behavior constituted breaking and entering, trespassing, and potentially harassment. They told her that good intentions don't excuse illegal entry into someone's home. They issued her a formal warning and strongly advised me to get a restraining order if her behavior continued. Patricia's husband arrived while the police were still at my house. He was absolutely mortified when he found out what his wife had been doing. He apologized profusely and promised to make sure she stayed away from my property entirely. He mentioned, somewhat embarrassingly, that Patricia had obsessive-compulsive tendencies and a deep psychological need to control her environment, but acknowledged that wasn't an excuse for violating other people's boundaries and property rights. He said they'd been in counseling about her inability to respect other people's spaces and choices. After the police involvement, I took additional security measures. I installed cameras at all entrances to my property, changed all my locks, including the one on my garage, and made absolutely certain to double-check that all doors and gates were locked whenever I left the house. I also documented all of Patricia's previous intrusions, in case I needed to pursue a restraining order. Patricia has stayed completely away from my property since the police got involved, which has been an enormous relief. But I occasionally catch her staring at my yard from her window, probably critiquing my lawn length or the way I've arranged my patio furniture. I can only imagine the mental commentary she's making about my property maintenance choices, but at least she's keeping those thoughts to herself now instead of acting on them. That's the end of that story. Breaking into someone's house to reorganize their kitchen because you think you know better than they do about food storage is genuinely unhinged behavior. The fact that she thought climbing over fences and entering locked properties was normal, helpful neighbor stuff shows how completely detached from reality some people can be. Some folks really need to learn that being helpful requires actually being asked for help first. Let's dive into a workplace situation where someone discovered their coworker was running a very personal side hustle during business hours. I'm 26 years old and work as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized tech company downtown. Our office has an open floor plan with shared workspaces and glass-walled conference rooms, which means you generally have a pretty good sense of what your co-workers are doing throughout the day. Or at least you think you do until you discover someone's been running an entirely separate business right under everyone's noses. My co-worker Jake sits at the desk directly next to mine. We've worked together for about 18 months since I started at the company, and I'd always thought he was a pretty normal, reasonably hard-working guy. Jake would come in early most days, sometimes stay late when we had project deadlines, and always seemed busy with something on his computer. I never had any reason to question what he was actually working on during those long hours at his desk. About 2 months ago, I was walking past Jake's desk on my way to a meeting in one of our conference rooms when I happened to glance at his monitors. He has a 2-monitor setup, like most of us, and he'd positioned them in a way that made them visible from certain angles when you walked by. One of his screens appeared to be showing some kind of dating profile or relationship coaching website. I figured maybe he was just browsing during a break or on his lunch hour, which wouldn't have been a big deal. We're all human, and occasional personal internet use during downtime isn't something anyone really cares about. But then I started noticing patterns that seemed odd. Jake always seemed to be typing furiously on his keyboard, even during periods when we didn't have any major projects with tight deadlines. He'd position his monitors throughout the day in ways that made it difficult for people walking by to see what he was working on, and he'd quickly switch screens or minimize windows whenever our manager approached his desk to ask him questions or check on project status. My curiosity finally got the better of me one afternoon when Jake went to the bathroom and left his computer unlocked. I know it was wrong to look at his screen without permission, and I'm not proud of violating his privacy that way. But something felt really off about Jake's behavior, and I wanted to confirm whether my suspicions were justified or if I was just being paranoid about a co-worker who valued privacy. What I found was absolutely shocking and completely validated my concerns. Jake had been running a full-scale online dating coaching business entirely during work hours, using company time and company resources for his personal entrepreneurial venture. He had multiple professional-looking websites set up, selling his services, online courses he was marketing and selling, and he was even conducting live video coaching sessions with clients right from his desk at our office. Jake's dating coaching business was extensive, sophisticated, and clearly taking up the vast majority of his workday. He had coaching sessions scheduled throughout every morning and afternoon, sometimes back-to-back for hours. He had hundreds of client emails he was responding to during business hours. He was managing multiple marketing campaigns for his side business, creating content for social media accounts, recording video lessons for his online courses. The amount of time and effort he was putting into his personal business while supposedly working full-time for our company was absolutely staggering. I struggled with what to do about this information. On one hand, Jake's side business wasn't technically hurting me personally or affecting my work directly. He seemed to be fulfilling some of his job responsibilities, even if he was also running an entire separate company on the side. On the other hand, he was essentially stealing from our employer by doing almost no actual work while collecting a full-time salary and benefits. That seemed fundamentally wrong and unfair. The decision about whether to report Jake was made for me about a week later. Our manager called a team meeting and asked me to take over covering some of Jake's projects temporarily while he was supposedly swamped with urgent work on a major campaign. I realized in that moment that Jake was using the excuse of being incredibly busy with company work to avoid actual job responsibilities while he focused on growing his coaching business. His deception was now creating extra work for me and other team members who had to pick up his slack. I felt I had no choice but to report what I'd discovered to our manager. I provided screenshots I'd discreetly taken of Jake's screen showing his coaching websites, his client scheduling calendar, and emails related to his business. Our manager was initially skeptical, probably thinking I had some personal grudge against Jake or was misinterpreting what I'd seen, but she decided to have our IT department monitor Jake's computer activity for a few days to verify my claims. What IT discovered confirmed everything I'd reported and revealed even more extensive abuse of company time and resources. Jake had been running his entire dating coaching business operation during work hours for at least 8 months, possibly longer. He'd barely completed any of his assigned marketing projects for our company, instead delegating them to other team members whenever possible, or simply letting deadlines slide while he focused on his coaching clients and course students. The IT audit showed that Jake spent an average of 7 hours per day working on his side business during his supposed 8-hour work shift. He'd made approximately $30,000 from his coaching business over those 8 months, all while collecting his full salary of $70,000 per year from our company. He'd essentially been double-dipping, getting paid twice for the same hours, using our company's internet, electricity, and office space to run his personal business. When Jake was confronted with the evidence by our manager and HR, he initially tried to claim that his dating coaching business was related to professional development in marketing and therefore relevant to his role at our company. He argued that learning about online marketing, social media engagement, and digital course creation for his coaching business made him a better marketer for our tech company. Our management didn't buy this argument for even a second, especially since Jake's coaching focused specifically on dating and relationships, which had absolutely nothing to do with our company's business software products. Jake was fired immediately for gross misuse of company resources and what HR termed time theft. He was also required to return company equipment he'd been using for his personal business, including a high-end laptop and professional video camera he'd checked out from our media department months earlier for supposed marketing video projects that had never materialized. The fallout from Jake's termination was complicated and created some tension in our office. Some co-workers thought I'd been a snitch for reporting him, arguing that what he did on his computer was his own business and didn't affect anyone else. But other team members were actually relieved that his lack of contribution had finally been addressed and consequences had been applied. I'd been absorbing extra work for months because Jake wasn't pulling his weight on shared projects, so I didn't feel even slightly guilty about exposing what was essentially an ongoing fraud against our employer. Our manager actually thanked me privately for bringing the situation to her attention. She said the company had been paying Jake's full salary while getting almost zero return on that investment, and that his behavior had been affecting team performance and morale in ways that weren't immediately obvious. His termination opened up a position for someone who would actually do the work they were being paid to do. That's the end of that story. Running an entire separate business during work hours while pretending to be swamped with company projects is next-level workplace fraud. The fact that he made $30,000 on the side while collecting his full salary shows exactly how much company time he was stealing. Some people really think they're clever enough to get away with anything. Now let's shift to a family story about someone who thought they could rewrite history by destroying evidence of the past. I'm 32 years old, and my younger brother Simon is 29. We grew up in what could only be described as a pretty dysfunctional household. Our father was a severe alcoholic who was verbally and emotionally abusive throughout our entire childhood. Our home life was unpredictable and often scary. We never knew which version of our father we'd encounter when we got home from school, whether he'd be passed out drunk, in a rage about something trivial, or occasionally sober and trying to make up for his previous behavior. Both Simon and I have spent years in therapy as adults, working through the trauma of growing up in that environment. We've had to unlearn unhealthy coping mechanisms, rebuild our self-esteem, and figure out how to have normal relationships despite the dysfunctional example we grew up with. It's been a long, difficult process for both of us, though we've approached healing in very different ways. About 5 years ago, our father passed away from liver failure at the age of 58. His death brought up a lot of complicated, conflicting emotions for both Simon and me. While we were relieved to finally be free from his abuse and the constant anxiety he created in our lives, we also felt unexpected grief and regret about the relationship we'd never been able to have with him. We mourned not the father we had, but the father we should have had, the parent he could have been if he'd gotten help for his addiction. After our father died, our mother asked Simon and me to help clean out the family house where we'd grown up. It was a difficult, emotionally draining process. Going through decades of belongings and family possessions meant confronting countless painful memories. Every room held reminders of our troubled childhood, of incidents we'd spent years trying to forget or process in therapy. During the clean-out, I found several boxes in the basement filled with old family videos, photographs, and other documentation of our childhood. Some of these materials captured happy memories from before our father's drinking got really severe, moments of normalcy and family joy that did exist in between the chaos. But other items documented some of the darker aspects of our family life. There were videos where you could clearly see our father intoxicated, slurring his words and behaving inappropriately. There were photographs that showed damage to our home from his violent outbursts. There were medical records and police reports that provided evidence of the dysfunction we'd lived through. I wanted to preserve these materials, not because I enjoyed having documentation of our family trauma, but because I felt they were important historical records of our actual lived experience. My therapist had encouraged me to acknowledge what had really happened in our childhood, rather than pretending everything had been normal or minimizing the abuse. She said that holding on to the truth of our experience was important for continuing to heal and process our trauma. Simon had a completely different perspective on what to do with these family archives. He wanted to destroy all evidence of our father's alcoholism and abuse. He argued passionately that keeping these materials served no useful purpose except to keep us mentally and emotionally trapped in the past. Simon said he wanted to remember only the good parts of our childhood, the few happy moments that existed, and completely erase everything else from our family history. We had several difficult conversations about what to do with the boxes of family documentation. I tried to explain my therapeutic reasons for wanting to preserve them, while Simon emphasized his need to move forward by eliminating all reminders of our trauma. We couldn't reach an agreement that satisfied both of us. Eventually, we agreed to disagree about the ultimate fate of the family archives. I took the boxes to my house for safekeeping while we figured out a plan that might work for both of us. I promised Simon that I wouldn't share the materials publicly or use them in any way that would embarrass our family. I just wanted to preserve them as part of our personal family history, available to us if we ever wanted or needed to reference them. 3 months ago, I started noticing that some of the boxes in my storage room had been disturbed. Items weren't quite where I'd left them, photographs were out of order, and a few specific items seemed to be missing entirely. I initially thought maybe I'd misremembered how I'd organized everything, or perhaps I'd moved things around at some point and forgotten about it. But then more items started disappearing over the following weeks. Specific photographs would be gone. Certain videotapes would vanish from the boxes. The pattern of what was missing became clear. Anything that showed our father's worst behavior, anything that documented his alcoholism or the damage it caused, was systematically being removed. I set up a small hidden security camera in my storage room to see if someone was accessing the boxes without my permission. What the camera captured over the next 2 weeks was both infuriating and heartbreaking. Simon had somehow gotten a copy of my house key, probably made from my spare key when he'd visited months earlier. He was sneaking into my home when I was at work, going directly to my storage room, and systematically going through the family archives. The camera footage showed Simon carefully selecting photographs and videos that showed our father's worst behavior. He'd examine each item, and if it depicted our father drunk, angry, or otherwise behaving badly, Simon would take it with him. He'd then carefully rearrange the remaining items in the boxes to try to hide evidence of his theft. He'd been doing this for weeks, possibly even months before I'd installed the camera, slowly removing pieces of our family history that he found too painful to know existed. When I confronted Simon with the video evidence, he completely broke down emotionally. He admitted what he'd been doing and tried to explain his reasoning through tears. He said he couldn't stand knowing that documentation of our father's abuse still existed somewhere in the world. Every time he thought about those photographs and videos sitting in my storage room, preserved for posterity, it triggered severe anxiety and made it difficult for him to move forward with his life and continue his own healing process. Simon explained that he'd been having nightmares about our childhood ever since he'd helped me pack those boxes. He said he'd become obsessed with the idea that as long as physical evidence of our trauma existed, he couldn't fully escape from it. He genuinely believed that by destroying the documentation, he could somehow erase or minimize the psychological impact our childhood had on both of us. I tried to explain to Simon that he didn't have the right to make that decision unilaterally for both of us. These were shared family materials, documentation of experiences we'd both lived through. His personal discomfort with the materials didn't justify breaking into my home and stealing items that belonged to both of us. His actions had violated my trust, my property rights, and my own process of dealing with our shared trauma. Simon apologized repeatedly and promised to return whatever materials he still had in his possession that he hadn't yet destroyed. But he also had to admit that he'd already destroyed many of the items he'd taken over the previous months. He'd been burning photographs, recording over videotapes, shredding documents, all in a misguided attempt to eliminate evidence of our father's worst behavior and the pain it had caused. The photographs and videos Simon destroyed are gone forever, irretrievably lost. We'll never get them back, and that loss feels significant to me, even though the content was painful and difficult to look at. He took away my ability to control my own relationship with our family narrative, to decide for myself what parts of our history to preserve, what to release, what to keep private versus what to potentially share with future family members who might benefit from understanding our history. Our relationship has been seriously strained since this incident. I understand intellectually that Simon was acting out of his own unprocessed trauma and psychological pain. His actions came from desperation and fear, not malice. But that understanding doesn't excuse him breaking into my home repeatedly, lying to me about the missing items, and destroying irreplaceable family materials without my consent. Trust, once broken in such a fundamental way, is incredibly difficult to rebuild, especially between people who've already been through so much trauma together. We're both back in therapy, individually and occasionally together, trying to work through this new breach of trust on top of our childhood trauma. It's been a difficult, painful process. Simon is working on understanding why he felt destroying evidence would somehow heal his wounds, and I'm working on forgiving him for violating my boundaries in such a significant way. That's the end of that story. Breaking into your brother's house repeatedly to destroy family photos because they're too painful for you to know they exist shows how unprocessed trauma can drive people to do destructive, boundary-violating things. The fact that he thought erasing evidence would somehow erase the actual experiences and their impact shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how trauma and healing actually work. Some wounds can't be undone by destroying reminders of what caused them. Speaking of people who think they can control other people's lives and narratives, this next story involves someone who took professional networking and mentorship to an absolutely creepy, boundary-violating extreme. I'm 24 years old and recently started my first real job out of college at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. After 4 years of studying communications and marketing, I was incredibly excited about this opportunity. The position seemed perfect. Good salary, room for advancement, interesting clients, and a team of experienced marketers I could learn from. I was eager to make a good impression with my new colleagues and supervisors, to prove that I deserved the opportunity they'd given me. What I didn't expect, couldn't have predicted, was that my enthusiasm and eagerness to learn would be interpreted as an invitation for one particular coworker to become completely, inappropriately obsessed with me and my life. My direct supervisor, Amanda, is in her late 30s and has been with the company for about 12 years. She's well respected in the industry, knowledgeable about digital marketing trends, and seemed like she'd be an ideal mentor when I first started. Amanda took me under her wing immediately during my first week, offering to show me the ropes, help me navigate the company culture, introduce me to important contacts. I was genuinely grateful for her attention and guidance. For the first few weeks, Amanda's mentorship seemed completely normal and professional. She'd invite me to lunch to discuss projects and strategy, introduce me to clients and other industry contacts at networking events, offer advice about career development and professional growth. I thought I was incredibly lucky to have such a supportive, engaged supervisor who seemed genuinely invested in my success. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Amanda's professional interest in my development shifted into something much more personal and invasive. She started asking increasingly detailed questions about my personal life, my relationships, my family background and history. She wanted to know exactly where I lived, what neighborhood, what my apartment looked like. She asked what I did on weekends, who my friends were, whether I was dating anyone seriously. The questions felt intrusive and went far beyond normal supervisor-employee rapport, but I answered honestly because I thought transparency and openness were important in building a good professional relationship. Amanda began inserting herself into my life outside of work, in ways that felt inappropriate, but that I struggled to address directly without seeming ungrateful or paranoid. She'd suggest we grab drinks after the office closed, turning work conversations into social outings. She'd invite me to weekend events like brunches or shopping trips, blurring the line between supervisor and friend. She'd send me text messages late at night, sometimes after 11 or midnight, about non-work topics, like articles she thought I'd find interesting, or questions about my weekend plans. The boundary between my supervisor and my friend, between professional mentorship and personal relationship, was becoming dangerously blurred in ways I didn't know how to address without potentially damaging an important professional connection. Things started to feel genuinely uncomfortable when Amanda began showing up at places I'd casually mentioned going to or frequenting. If I mentioned I was planning to check out a new restaurant that had opened in my neighborhood, Amanda would somehow be there when I arrived, acting surprised to see me. If I mentioned attending a particular yoga class on Saturday mornings, she'd join the same class the following week. If I posted about a coffee shop I liked on Instagram, she'd start going there regularly and sending me photos of herself there. The coincidences were far too frequent and far too specific to actually be coincidental. Amanda was clearly tracking my movements and activities, using information I'd shared to essentially stalk my personal life under the guise of shared interests. I started being much less forthcoming about my personal plans and activities, giving vague or non-specific answers when Amanda asked about my schedule or my weekend plans. But she seemed to have other ways of tracking and monitoring my activities that didn't rely on me volunteering information. She'd make specific comments about posts I'd shared on social media, places I'd checked into on various apps, people I'd been photographed with at events. Her level of detailed awareness about my personal life outside of work was genuinely unsettling and inappropriate. The situation reached what I thought was the peak of discomfort when I discovered Amanda had been accessing and reading my personal email account without my knowledge or permission. Our company has a shared server system for work email, and Amanda apparently used her administrative access privileges to read emails I'd sent from my work computer to friends, family, and even my boyfriend. I discovered this violation when Amanda confronted me one day about a private email I'd sent to my boyfriend complaining about work stress. In the email, I'd vented about feeling overwhelmed with my workload and had mentioned considering whether I might want to start looking for other opportunities if the stress level didn't improve. Amanda was visibly upset that I'd criticized the company and suggested I might not stay long term, but the only possible way Amanda could have known about that email's contents was if she'd been systematically reading my private correspondence. When I realized Amanda had been spying on my personal communications, monitoring my private thoughts and conversations, I immediately reported her behavior to Human Resources. I explained the escalating pattern of inappropriate supervision, the invasive questions about my personal life, her appearances at places I'd mentioned, and finally, the email surveillance that had clearly crossed legal and ethical lines. The company's IT department investigated and confirmed that Amanda had been regularly accessing my email account without any legitimate business authorization or need. She'd been reading my emails for months, a clear violation of company policy, professional ethics, and potentially illegal depending on the specific communications she'd accessed. The HR investigation into Amanda's behavior revealed something that made the whole situation even more disturbing. I was actually the third young female employee in 5 years to report similar boundary violations and inappropriate supervision from Amanda. Previous complaints had been handled quietly with warnings and counselling rather than termination, which meant Amanda had been allowed to continue the pattern of behaviour with new targets. Amanda was finally terminated after my complaint, given the severity of the email surveillance and her documented pattern of similar behaviour with other employees. But not before she sent me a long, rambling message trying to justify her actions. She claimed I'd completely misunderstood her intentions, that she'd only been trying to help me succeed and advance in my career. She said that reading my emails was just her way of staying informed about my well-being and state of mind, that all truly dedicated mentors took such personal, detailed interest in their mentees' lives and thoughts. The mental gymnastics required to justify reading someone's private emails, stalking their social media, showing up at their personal activities, all as appropriate professional mentorship, were genuinely impressive and deeply disturbing. Amanda seemed to genuinely believe that her intrusive, boundary-violating behavior was not only acceptable, but actually exemplary supervision. That's the end of that story. Using your administrative access to read a subordinate's personal emails and then justifying it as thorough mentorship is about as clear an abuse of power and position as it gets. The fact that she had an established pattern of this behavior with multiple young female employees makes it even more predatory and disturbing. Some people really shouldn't be in supervisory positions where they have power over others and access to private information. Our final story comes from someone whose ex decided that if he couldn't have the relationship, he'd at least try to financially ruin his former partner. I'm 27 years old and recently ended a 3-year relationship with my boyfriend Marcus. The relationship had become increasingly toxic over the final year we were together, with Marcus becoming progressively more controlling and jealous about every aspect of my life. He wanted to know where I was at all times, who I was talking to, what I was doing. He'd check my phone, question my friendships, try to isolate me from my support system. Breaking up with Marcus was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was absolutely necessary for my mental health and my future. Marcus didn't take the breakup well at all. He cycled between begging me to reconsider, promising he'd change, and angrily accusing me of ruining his life and wasting 3 years of his time. I tried to be compassionate, but absolutely firm about my decision. The relationship was over. It wasn't healthy for either of us, and I needed him to respect that boundary and start moving on with his life. We'd lived together for 2 years, which meant untangling our shared life was complicated and took time. We had joint bank accounts that needed to be closed and divided, shared subscriptions and services that needed to be cancelled or transferred, belongings and furniture that needed to be fairly divided between us. I tried to handle everything as fairly and equitably as possible, making sure Marcus got his share of everything we'd acquired together, that neither of us felt taken advantage of or treated unfairly in the division of our shared property and financial accounts. About 2 weeks after Marcus finally moved out of our shared apartment, I started noticing unusual charges appearing on my credit card statement. Small purchases at first, coffee shops and convenience stores, amounts small enough that I might have overlooked them or assumed I'd just forgotten making those purchases. $5 here, $12 there, amounts that didn't immediately trigger alarm or concern. But then the charges became significantly larger and more frequent. Someone was using my credit card information to make substantial online purchases, book hotel rooms in different cities, even buy expensive electronics and luxury items. The total fraudulent charges added up to over $7,000 before I noticed the clear pattern and immediately froze my card and reported it as compromised. I immediately suspected Marcus, since he'd had complete access to all my financial information throughout our 3-year relationship. We'd shared credit cards for convenience, he'd known all my account numbers and security codes, He'd had every possible opportunity to record or memorize my financial information before moving out. When I confronted Marcus about the fraudulent charges, showing him the credit card statements with purchases I definitely hadn't made, he denied everything at first. He acted offended that I'd even suggest he'd do something so dishonest and illegal. But when I mentioned I was planning to involve the police and show them clear evidence of his access to my financial accounts and information, Marcus's story suddenly changed, and he admitted what he'd been doing. Marcus claimed he'd been using my credit card as a form of fair compensation for all the time, money, and emotional energy he'd invested in our 3-year relationship. He said, I owed him for emotional labor, for supporting me during difficult times, for 3 years of his life that he'd never get back and couldn't reclaim. The mental gymnastics and twisted logic required to justify credit card fraud as some kind of emotional restitution or relationship debt settlement were genuinely staggering. I immediately filed a police report and provided them with substantial evidence linking Marcus to the fraudulent purchases. Email confirmations for online orders sent to his email address, shipping addresses that went directly to his new apartment, and most damningly, the fact that he'd actually admitted to making the charges in our text message conversation, thinking he could justify theft as compensation for emotional investment. Marcus was arrested within a week and charged with credit card fraud and identity theft. During the police investigation, they discovered he'd also been using my personal information to open entirely new credit card accounts in my name without my knowledge or consent. He'd been running up debt on cards I didn't even know existed, cards that would eventually damage my credit score and financial standing when payments weren't made. The total amount Marcus had stolen or fraudulently borrowed using my name and information was over $15,000 by the time the investigation uncovered all the accounts and charges. Some of the fraudulent accounts had been open for months, accumulating interest and fees, while I remained completely unaware of their existence. The legal process of dealing with Marcus's extensive fraud was absolutely exhausting and expensive, even though I wasn't ultimately responsible for the fraudulent debt. I had to dispute all the charges with multiple credit card companies, close and reopen various accounts, freeze my credit to prevent further fraud, and spend literally countless hours on the phone with banks, credit bureaus, and fraud departments, explaining the situation over and over. The financial damage Marcus had caused would take many months to fully resolve and repair. What made the betrayal feel even worse was realizing that Marcus had been planning this systematic fraud from the very moment I told him our relationship was over. He'd methodically gathered and recorded my financial information during our last weeks together, knowing full well that he intended to use it maliciously and illegally once he no longer had legitimate access to my financial resources and support. Marcus eventually pleaded guilty to multiple fraud and identity theft charges to avoid going to trial. He received 2 years probation plus substantial restitution orders, requiring him to pay back all the money he'd stolen, plus additional penalties and fees. He's legally required to make monthly payments to reimburse me, but I'm honestly not holding my breath waiting for those payments to actually materialize. People who commit this kind of fraud rarely have the financial means or the ethical inclination to actually make their victims whole. The whole traumatic experience taught me to be exponentially more careful about sharing financial information, even with romantic partners I trust deeply. Marcus showed me that people can change dramatically, can become vindictive and cruel when they feel hurt or rejected. Someone I'd loved and lived with for 3 years, someone I'd trusted with my most private information, became someone who actively worked to harm me financially out of spite and misplaced resentment. That's the end of that story. Using your ex-girlfriend's credit card to rack up $15,000 in fraudulent charges while claiming she owes you for emotional labor and relationship investment is peak entitlement and criminal thinking. The fact that he was systematically planning this theft while still living together, gathering information he knew he'd use maliciously, makes it even more calculated and cruel. Some people really will burn down everything around them, destroy anyone who rejects them, rather than accepting that a relationship has run its natural course and ended. Whether these stories helped you drift off into peaceful sleep or kept you wide awake wondering about the people in your own life, thanks for hanging out with me through all this madness and chaos. Subscribe for more, and I'll catch you tomorrow.